Hey there, my name is Seakga Tladi. This year is African Disclosure, and this is our program for today. Right, so on today's show, we've got quite a packed one. We've got 3 conversations and 3 interviews that we have to have. And our show today is gonna try to connect the dots between high-level international diplomacy, economic sovereignty, and the daily realities that we face on the ground right here in South Africa. We're going to be unpacking 3 stories that define our current geopolitical landscape, starting in India. South Africa's deputy president has just completed a high-level visit to India, and we've managed to get an interview with Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperations, Minister Thandi Moraka. And we're going to be speaking with her about the relations between South Africa and India. We're going to be looking at the targeted push for $200 billion in bilateral trade. We're going to be looking at the relationship between India and South Africa and India and the wider African continent. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about BRICS. And right there, we've sent one of our journalists in India to get an interview with the minister. And then we're going to be moving on, turning our eyes to Russia and the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. So we have got global powers actively courting African nations at this forum. I think that's going to be a big theme because Africa is really in a golden position. Everyone wants to do business with Africa. And at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, that is going to be one of the key factors, Africa, right? But there's a question that we must look at. Is Africa arriving at this forum with a unified voice and genuine leverage? And how close are we to breaking the structural vulnerability of the US dollar to protect our regional trade? And then finally, we're going to bring it all the way back home, breaking down this recent story with fuel in South Africa. So diesel has got a little bit of a levy and the price is going to come down because our government has tried to help in that regard. But we're going to be looking at some of the structural flaws in our economy that keep food and transport prices stubbornly high, even when government does implement these fuel relief measures. So we're going to be having quite a few conversations and all of them are quite interesting. So you do want to stick with us. My name is Seakga Tladi. Let's get it going. All right, let's get into it. So let's start in India, right? Over the past week, South Africa's deputy president made his first official visit to India since South Africa's 2024 national elections. And accompanying him was Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Minister Thandi Moraka, who sat down for an interview with Sputnik Africa to share what this visit means, not just for South Africa and India, but for the entire global South. And what came out of the conversation is, frankly, it's worth paying close attention to, right? So I want to break down some of the key elements of this interview before sharing it with you so you can hear it straight from the horse's mouth. So let's start with the big picture. Why India? And why India now? So South Africa and India share a long and layered history, from the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi and his early activism on South African soil. Now look, we know about some of the controversies of Mahatma Gandhi and some of the criticisms that are leveled at his activism in South Africa. So we're not trying in any way to look at South African and Indian history with rose-colored glasses. We're aware of the realities of the somewhat problematic nature of Mahatma Gandhi's activism, but nonetheless, it's a part of South African history, right? South African and Indian history particularly. And then from those early days, we've also had decades of post-apartheid diplomatic cooperation between South Africa and India. Today, both South Africa and India sit together at some of the most consequential tables, right? The G20, we are two named countries in BRICS, India and South Africa. And we sit on various other multilateral forums. So there's that relationship between South Africa and India that's very important. But this visit wasn't just about history and that relationship, it was about the future, and specifically about money. Right now, bilateral trade between South Africa and India sits at around $18 billion. But there's a stated goal, a bigger stated goal that comes out in this interview. And the stated goal of this interview is $200 billion by 2030. So we want to go from $18 billion today to $200 billion by 2030. That's not a small gap to cover. That is more than a tenfold increase in under 6 years. So when our Sputnik Africa journalist asked how both countries plan to bridge the gap, Minister Moraka was direct. South Africa sees India as one of its most strategic economic partners. A country of 1.5 billion people with advanced development capabilities and a massive consumer market. That is what South Africa is looking at when we look at India. For context, South Africa's own population sits at around 63 million. So the opportunities for trade flows in both directions are enormous, and both sides know this. Both South Africa and India know this. So that's that part of the coin. But one of the other most striking parts about this conversation was how often the word gateway came up. South Africa wants to be India's gateway into the African continent, and South Africa sees India as its gateway into Southeast Asia. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship. It's a bridge. And it speaks to a broader strategic logic that both nations are operating from. When South African products land in India, the thinking goes that they're not just reaching Indian consumers, but they're reaching the entire Southeast Asian market. And when Indian companies invest in South Africa, they're not just entering South Africa, they're entering the whole continent, a continent of over 1 billion people. And with South Africa currently serving as the interim chair of the Southern African Development Community, this presents a particularly special opportunity. As the chair of SADC, we are in a lot of ways the gateway to SADC, right? So this is economic diplomacy at its most deliberate. But let's talk about one of the most urgent and human dimensions of this relationship between South Africa and India. So we've spoken a little bit about trade now, but let's get into something a little bit more human, and that is health. India is often called the pharmacy of the world. And for African nations, that is incredibly true. It's not just a catchphrase, it's a lifeline. Africa has long relied on Indian pharmaceutical companies for affordable HIV medicine, and Minister Moraka was candid about this, pointing out that the progress that the continent has made in fighting the HIV pandemic has been enabled by India's pharmaceutical sector. That relationship, Minister Moraka made clear, needs to deepen and not stall. We must also remember that we're facing the problem of Ebola right now. Right now, there's an active Ebola outbreak in the DRC. And while it hasn't crossed into South Africa yet, the threat is real. And the urgency is palpable. Minister Moraka called on Indian pharmaceutical companies to view South Africa not just as a trading partner, but as a base of operations for addressing health crises across the continent. And this is partly why the India-Africa Forum Summit was recently postponed, a gesture of solidarity, acknowledging the gravity of the situation on the ground. The World Health Organization is involved, African Union member states are engaged, and Minister Moraka expressed cautious optimism that this Ebola outbreak can be contained. But the message to Indian pharmaceutical companies was clear that Africa needs you and it needs you now. So that's the other dimension, the health relationship between South Africa and India. But let's shift gears. Let's talk about money. Let's talk about the global financial system and why South Africa has been pushing hard to reform it. South Africa, as we know, recently held the G20 presidencies, and one of its top agenda items was calling for the reform of international financial institutions. So this is your IMF, your World Bank, and the broader structure of global lending. The critique is sharp and specific, right? When African countries take loans from these institutions, the debt burdens and interest rates attached to these loans often work against development rather than for it. Governments end up having to choose between servicing foreign debt and delivering services to their own citizens, the very people who elected them. And in this interview, it's clearly argued that that is not development finance, that is a trap. So in response, South Africa and its BRICS partners have championed the new development bank, an alternative multilateral lender designed to fund infrastructure and development projects on terms that can actually serve the borrowing nations. Just recently, the Development Bank approved loans to South Africa's Transnet to support our rail sector, and we have also got a loan for water sanitation and infrastructure. These are tangible, on-the-ground investments, and they signal what a different kind of development finance can look like. And then there's also movement on the currency front, right? We have been thinking about this for a long time on this show, but we know that India's Reserve Bank, the central bank, has proposed a system to connect the digital currencies of BRICS countries for cross-border payments. And that's a massive step towards reducing dependence on the US dollars and Western financial models. It's still very, very early days, and in no ways is this a finalized matter. We're very far from having an integrated digital currency. But the direction is clear, right? But another thing we have to address as we think about this interview is the elephant in the room. And that is the changing global order. The United States is pulling back from multilateral institutions. And then China and Russia are asserting themselves in these multilateral institutions. And India is growing in influence as well. Nations across the global south, including South Africa, are saying that, we need to chart our own course as the Americans pull back from multilateral institutions. So when asked directly where South Africa positions itself in this emerging multipolar world, the minister's answer was principled and unflinching. She recommitted or explained South Africa's firm commitment to the non-aligned movement, a foreign policy tradition that goes back decades and rooted in the idea that smaller nations should not be forced to choose sides between great powers. South African foreign policy, our minister emphasized, is guided by respect for the rule of law, human rights, and constitutional democracy. And quite critically, our foreign policy is guided by the sovereignty of every nation, regardless of its size or power. And this interview also has a message for Western powers. And it's one that I agree with. Is that stop undermining the sovereignty of other countries. Why can't we work within multilateral institutions and build what she calls a progressive internationalism? A world where nations can live side by side without aggression or discrimination. It's a vision, and whether the great powers are listening or not, it's still a vision. And then there was one more issue that came up as well, and it's one that affects all of us. That is energy and the conflict in the Middle East. South Africa's energy profile is diverse: coal, oil, gas, and a renewable energy sector that is growing. South Africa has its own power utility and has largely managed its electricity security domestically. But the conflicts involving Iran, Israel, and the United States, and the tension it's creating around the Strait of Hormuz is really causing concern. So for a country like South Africa, which relies on oil and gas as part of its energy mix, that matters. So the minister's call in this interview was firm, right? All conflicting parties must return to the negotiating table. Diplomacy, not escalation. She noted that talks appeared to be underway and expressed hopes that the parties would sober up, in her words, and reach an agreement, restoring the international rules-based order that allows global commerce and global life to function. So what do we take from all of this, now that we've sort of broken down the minister's main points before we listen to her? Well, what we're seeing through this visit to India, through this conversation, is a South Africa that is confident, on the international scale at least, strategic, and increasingly vocal on the world stage. A country that's leveraging its relationships within India, within BRICS, within SADC, within the African Union, to advance a clear agenda. Economic development on African terms. Reform of a global financial system that hasn't served the African continent. And a foreign policy grounded in principle rather than in alignment with any power bloc. And the India relationship sits at the heart of much of this. Trade, pharmaceuticals, infrastructure, digital finance, multilateral cooperation. Our two countries are deeply intertwined, and both are betting that a stronger partnerships serves not only their own interest, but the interest of the broader global South. So this is a big ambition that our countries have, but listening to Minister Moraka speak, you can get the sense that South Africa is very serious about it. Now, I want you to hear this directly, right? It's time for us to listen to the interview. And before we get into it, we need to give a big shout out to our correspondent who put the interview together for us. So we work with journalists all over the world. We get you big interviews from wherever in the world that we can find them. And today, this interview was organized by Ajit Singh from one of our colleagues, and he managed to speak to the Deputy Minister. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our interview with Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperations, Minister Thandi Moraka.
Hello, ma'am. Welcome to India.
Oh, thank you very much, Rashid, and thanks to your viewers.
You were here with Deputy President on a working visit to India. Mm-hmm. So how was your visit so far here in India?
Yes, we are here accompanying the Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa, of course, on his first ever visit to India ever since we held our national and provincial government elections back in the year 2024. He is starting with this country on the basis that you would appreciate the fact that South Africa and India continues to share those historic relationships and also a diplomatic relationship that are even helping us to continue to cooperate between our two nations in various fields. And also we continue to participate with India in several multilateral forums. You would appreciate the fact that we are together with India in the G20, as well in IORA, and the IPSA,
Yeah.
where we continue to participate together, and the BRICS summit as well. We are told this year the BRICS summit will be hosted here in India in
Yes.
the coming few months. So we really continue to cooperate with India on those multilateral forum, and we are advancing our own interest as the countries of the global south on how do we navigate our way amidst this ever-changing global balance of forces, because you know those developments are characterized by elements of uncertainty, and it's important that progressive forces within the global south ought to strategically work together and make it a point that we advance our own developmental paths as the countries of the global south.
I was looking at the updates, and along with the Deputy President, you were actually meeting many of the industries delegates and representatives. My question is, the bilateral trade between India and South Africa currently stands on around $18 billion. The goal is $200 billion by 2030. So there is a huge gap. So how can both countries work together to fill this gap?
Yes, remember, India is the most strategic partner even at the issues of economic development initiatives. We look at India as a country that is more advanced in terms of their economic development initiatives, and also that India is the most populated country. We're speaking here about the 1.5 trillion people in India, and when you look at our South Africa's population, currently we're sitting at 63 million people, and that on its own must indicate that there's a lot of trade and investment activities that must come from both sides. We need to see those trade numbers starting to increase, and I need to indicate that South Africa has recently hosted the SA Investment Conference, where we have seen several Indian-based companies coming all the way to South Africa to really invest in the South Africa's economy and helping us to also transform our structure of our economy. And I need to indicate that without our economic diplomacy program, there wouldn't be any progress towards the growth of our individual economy. So we continue to encourage businesses and key industry role players to say, come to South Africa, especially those who are coming from India in various fields, of course, in the field of renewable energy space, in the field of health. You know, India is the pharmacy of the world.
Yeah.
And even now, South Africa is receiving a lot of pharmaceutical products from India already. When you speak about issues of HIV, you know, Africa as a continent has been battling with the fight against HIV, and we rely on India to help us on that fight. And even the recent developments in the continent, where we have several outbreaks of Ebola, we still want to urge pharmaceutical companies that are based here in India to really look at South Africa as a gateway to the rest of the continent. Of course, currently South Africa is the interim chair of the SADC region, which is another organ where we continue to advance the economic diplomacy agenda, because once your region is not developed economically, you'll from time to time be experiencing issues of migration, because people move from one country to another trying to seek for greener pastures. So how do we address this issue of migration without necessarily restricting the movements of people. We need to encourage our member states within our region where we participate in to say, let's work together and transform and develop your economic landscape in your country where you are staying. So we are the interim chair of that SADC organ, which gives us another opportunity for us to advance our issues around the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. Of course, we need to start first with the SACU negotiation framework, so that when you come to South Africa, already within the Southern African Custom Union, we are well coordinated and we are well organized on how can we leverage on the opportunities available within the continent of Africa through the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. So we really look at India on that strategic note, and also looking at India as a gateway as well to the Southeast Asia. Because when South African products come to India, we are therefore guaranteed that they will reach the rest of the Southeast Asian markets. So we'll really continue to reset those diplomatic ties with India and advance our economic development initiatives that are more mutually beneficial to our both nations.
I was going to ask about you about the pharmacy of the world code, but you mentioned about the Ebola and HIV.
Yeah.
So what is the current status of Ebola, and how the South African government is seeking assistance from Indian counterpart when it comes to supplying of medicines or any other things?
Ebola outbreak is a pandemic that is currently being experienced in the DRC, and it's not yet in South Africa yet. Hence, you have seen the initial program for India-Africa Forum having been postponed on the basis of India pledging solidarity with the rest of the continent. But the issue of Ebola in the continent is receiving the necessary attention by various member states within the AU, which is our own region where we coming from, and the contribution as well from the World Health Organization is really being appreciated towards the measures that are being put in place to contain that outbreak, because so far we are really convinced and looking forward to a situation where this outbreak is being managed and being dealt with, so that people can start to move freely and we can now start to attend events even beyond the borders of our continent. So rest assured, we will continue to rely on the pharmaceutical companies from India to also look at Africa differently and also come in and extend a hand now, because Africa needs their support more than ever. We need those pharmaceutical products to come so that we can be able to control all these outbreaks that continue to befall our continent of Africa. And also on matters of HIV and AIDS, Africa as a continent has managed to fight against HIV/AIDS pandemic because of the support that we always have with the companies that are in the pharmaceutical space that are coming from India. So we are really urging those that are in that space to approach various member states within the continent of Africa and also within the SADC region where we are based as South Africa, to really come and engage with us as the authorities in those regions, and we will create an environment for them to really come and bring their products so that we address all those health challenges that our people have been faced with.
My next question is regarding the world trade. So President Cyril Ramaphosa sees Africa as the future epicenter of world trade. If President is correct, and with his prediction, it would mean that intra-African trade would be essential for the continent. So what is South Africa's long-term vision when it comes to building a sovereign African trade system? Because we still rely on other trade systems.
Yes, remember we are the people who have recently held the G20 presidency,
Yes.
where we participated together with India and other group of the 20 that are participating in that multilateral forum. On the agenda of our G20 presidency was the issue of calling for the reforms on all the international monetary funding institutions, your IMF and your World Bank and all that. We are the ones that have put on the top of the agenda of the G20 those reforms that are currently being looked at by those members of the G20. We also have initiated the new development bank of the BRICS member states, where we are facilitating and calling for the issues of looking at how can the BRICS members continue to trade amongst each other, and seeing it that when you look at how the IMF and the WTO are looking at issues of funding for developmental initiatives, especially to the countries of the global south, those funding programs are not developmental in nature. So when we're calling for the new development bank, we want to advance our own economic development initiatives as the members of the BRICS, and seeing to it that we would be able to grow our economies as the countries of the BRICS plus countries.
Welcome back to our program. We have just been speaking to Deputy Minister Tladi Moraka, Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, speaking about the relationship between South Africa and India. And now it is time to move on. We're going to be taking a plane to Russia now. And in Russia, it is officially time for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And they call it SPEEF, right? The St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And SPEEF describes itself as a place where the new global economic order is being shaped. It's the Russian equivalent of Davos, right? And the theme for this year is pragmatic dialogue, the path to a stable future. Maybe it's worth saying that one again. Pragmatic dialogue, the path to a stable future. The thing I want to highlight there is this idea of a stable future, because that's absolutely imperative for all of us. And for Africa, the question is, where do we fit into that future? Are we ready to claim our place in this future that we talk about? So let's start with the numbers, because they tell a story on their own. This year's St. Petersburg International Economic Forum has drawn around 20,000 guests from around 130 countries. Government officials and politicians from 76 nations are in attendance. Saudi Arabia has been named the guest of honor, represented by its energy minister. The president of Uzbekistan and Tanzania are joining Russian President Vladimir Putin at the plenary session. And for the first time in nearly a decade, there's even a delegation from the United States present. How? The Americans are attending the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum for the first time in over a decade. And the US presence, it's a sign, I think, if nothing else. It's a sign of the gravitational pull of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. It's a sign that the gravitational pull of the forum is growing. You can't sit back and just ignore it now. If even the Americans are there, you can't sit back and ignore it. Now, the forum is, not without controversy. It opened under a cloud of black smoke, quite literally, after Ukrainian drones struck an oil terminal at a naval base near St. Petersburg. So the war in Ukraine hangs over the proceedings like a shadow, even if it doesn't appear anywhere in the official program. The tension between the forum's global ambitions and the reality of the ongoing conflict is a part of the story. But another big part of the story is Africa. And that's what I want to discuss today. So I want to focus on 3 ideas that I think really matter when it comes to Africa and this forum. And these are ideas that any serious African policymaker, business person, or citizen should be thinking about right now. The first is this one, and some of these ideas will be reiterated as we get into our interview. We're going to be interviewing an economist, a development economist from Malawi, and he's going to elaborate on some of these ideas more. But the first one is that as Africa, guys, we cannot afford to arrive at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum unprepared. There's a temptation when we talk about forums like SPIEF for us to get swept up in the excitement of new opportunities, right? Fair partnerships and a new platform, a new alternative to Western dominated institutions. There's an excitement to get swept up in that wave. And that excitement is not entirely misplaced, right? Russia, China, and other global South actors are actively courting African nations, right? So they're courting African nations to participate in this new global order that is not so dominated by the West. So that excitement is not entirely misplaced, because that's an important, it's an important facet, right? But amid all of that excitement, are we ready? Are we speaking with one voice, which is what we need to be ready to represent ourselves fairly at a forum like this? Right? Have we reckoned with the fact that an invitation to the table in this new global order, an invitation to the table is not the same as power at that table? Being at the table is not the same as having an effective voice at the table. And what do we need to have an effective voice when we go to tables like SPIEF? We need to speak with one voice. We need to be unified. We need to know what Africa needs as a continent and not individual countries. If we arrive at forums like SPIEF without a clear sense of what we want, what we have to offer, and what conditions we will and will not accept, then it doesn't matter who is courting Africa to join the new order. The same outcome will happen again. The same extraction will happen again. It's just this time it'll be dressed up as partnership. Africa's natural resources remain some of the most coveted on earth. Critical minerals, all of that. We've got all of that. These are not marginal assets. They are assets that the entire world is competing for. But too often, we go to international forums and, we're sort of begging rather than leveraging the genuine wealth that we sit on. So the solution here, I'm not saying, is to stay away from these forums, but the solution is to arrive ready, to have the internal African work of identifying what each country and each region brings to the table and being able to speak with one voice about what we will and will not do, to refuse deals that don't reflect the value that we see ourselves to have. And that brings me to the second idea. And that is the idea that Africa needs a unified voice. And that voice has to be built from the ground up. We can't have a situation where countries are competing with each other in our overlapping export areas. So when a major buyer comes, then we undercut each other. That can't happen. That weakens our position. It's a self-defeating position. So we need to speak with one voice. And the African Continental Free Trade Area is supposed to be part of the answer to this. On paper, it's the largest free trade area in the world by a number of participating countries, covering a market of over 1.4 billion people with a massive combined GDP. So the potential is extraordinary. But the gap between potential and reality remains a bit too big. Why? Because turning a signed agreement into a functioning trade system requires a lot. It requires political will. And that political will has to come from the major regional economies first. That means South Africa has to step into genuine economic leadership. We have to speak like a big unified bloc, and the African Union has sort of pointed the way. The African Union might be one of the ways. But we need to decide, in collaboration with forums like SPIEF, what our unified voice is saying. And then lastly, we need to speak of Africa's dependence on the US dollars. That is a structural vulnerability, and the moment to address that vulnerability is right now. We can't have this thing where two African countries are trading and they can't simply exchange their own currencies directly. They have to first go through the dollar. That means both countries lose value in every single transaction. It means their economies are exposed to fluctuations in the US monetary policy, a policy that we've got nothing to do with. And it means when Washington imposes sanctions on a country anywhere in the world, African trade can be caught in the crossfire, regardless of whether African governments had any say in the matter. And we've already seen what this looks like in practice. Zimbabwe is the case in point. A country whose access to international financial systems has been severely curtailed by unilateral Western sanctions, with devastating effects on ordinary Zimbabweans. So, alternatives being discussed at forums like SPIEF involve diversifying currencies used in trade, looking at the Chinese yuan. And within Africa, maybe let's use the South African rand, which already functions informally as a trading currency across much of the SADC region. So why don't we formalize the rand's role in regional trade, for instance? That could meaningfully reduce the macroeconomic instability that smaller economies like Malawi currently absorb every time the global dollar conditions shift. And maybe here's where we can think back to the proposed idea by India's Reserve Bank to integrate our digital currencies. Right? That's, again, a great idea to try and build a financial architecture that is more fair to us. Right? None of this is simple. None of this is simple, of course. It's all tough work that needs time and coordinated action from multiple major economies at the same time. Much of the dollar's power rests precisely on our universal agreement to use it. So shifting that requires a global movement. But that's exactly why these forums like SPIEF matter, because they are the spaces where these conversations can happen at a massive scale, where nations that have been on the margins of the current financial architecture can find a common cause and begin to build alternatives, like the Indian Reserve Bank is suggesting. And Africa cannot sit out on that conversation. We can't. Now, before I bring you the interview that we have been highlighting right now, I want to say one more thing. And I want to mention the involvement of Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan, who is participating in SPIEF as a high profile speaker. This is the first time a Tanzanian head of state has officially visited Russia in 50 years. And her presence matters not just symbolically, but strategically as well. It signals that Africa is watching the shift in global power and that at least some African leaders are willing to engage with the emerging order on their own terms. Now, whether or not her visit produces tangible outcomes for Tanzania and the continent will depend exactly on some of the things we've been discussing today. Whether she arrives with a clear agenda that is backed by regional coordination and the willingness to hold the line on the terms that actually serve African interests. The opportunity is real, and the risks are also real. And the work needed to convert opportunities into realities is urgent, but it's also unfinished. Now, I recently spoke to someone who's been thinking very hard about all of this. His name is Austin Chingwengwe, and he's a development economist at the National Planning Commission of Malawi. He sat down with us ahead of this year's St. Petersburg Forum to share his analysis of what Africa should be doing and what's holding the continent back and what a genuine win at a forum like this actually looks like. His perspective is grounded, and I think it's essential for anyone who cares about where Africa is headed in this fast-moving global moment. So without any further ado, I am pleased to welcome to our show Mr. Austin Chingwengwe. And right now, I want to speak to you about the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. I wanted to discuss the opening of this economic forum and how Russia is trying to position this forum as the answer to a shifting global order outside traditional Western centers of influence. So thank you for joining me on the show today. Firstly, so we do get the line from some African governments that they want diversified partners beyond these traditional Western centers. How can this St. Petersburg International Economic Forum practically help African countries deepen trade and investment ties with Russia while protecting their development priorities and policies?
No, thank you so much. But I think for Africans first is to get our houses in order. Mostly we do go to these forums for our discussions while we haven't yet said what are we selling. I think it's absurd to go there to be selling something which we don't have. Firstly, it's reorganizing our niches. What do we have in mining? Can we get it organized that we can start adding to beneficiation of those ones, the natural resources we have, our financial architecture. If we can organize it and we go there as a bloc, we'll go there at the position of strength. Other than we go there mostly when you follow the discussions there, we go there with a begging bowl, where we go to ask for assistance or to ask for favor. But if we reorganize ourselves and we recognize the wealth which we have, which I think most of these Western, and even if we go to the new economic order which is being established, which is a major economic core, and which might help Africa if we organize ourselves. But going there before we get our houses in order, it will still be problematic. We'll just shift to the new, from the old imperialism to the new imperialism. So there the trick is we organize ourselves and we go there with what do we want to achieve from there. I think we have, if you look at the financial economic order which we have around, is not structured to benefit Africans. So there is, we have to organize ourselves. We go there with what we want to benefit from there. Then I think we can negotiate, and this provide a platform where we can be, I think, kingmakers in the new economic order. Sure.
Yeah. So I guess it's pretty clear what you're saying about there is no use going to these international forums if we are singing from different hymn sheets, if we are not going there with a unified voice, then our bargaining position as Africa is somewhat weakened. So I guess my next question then would be, what does this unified African voice look like on the practical level? Does it mean a more powerful African Union? Does it mean a new collection of blocks like the SADC region speaking with each other? What does it mean to be organized before going to these conferences in the way that you say?
So, I think there you have started getting it. We can't organize at the regional level as Africa if we are failing to organize at these sub-regional levels, the SADC, the ECOWAS. So that's where we need to first get organized. And as Africa, I think the African Union has shown us a way with now having the African free continent trade. If we can start practicing within that, and we have these sub-regional groupings, the SADC, the ECOWAS, we organize what comparative advantages each bloc has. Then we aggregate that at a continent level. Then it's where we can make major headway. But it's to start reorganizing within Africa. There is a sub-region level blocks. Then we can have a very good bargaining power. But without a unified voice, it will not work for us.
Yeah, but I guess I would still want to know how it is. Practically, what does it look like for us to be organized? And maybe you could speak to some of the issues that we need to be organized around as we approach the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum.
No, thank you. Maybe I should clarify a little more. If we talk about, for example, the SADC regions, what are we good at as a region, which we can showcase? We have comparative advantage against our sister blocks. It is first recognizing this one, and even within the regions, we have the leaders and followers. If we look at the SADC, we have, for example, the South Africa, which is the economic giant within that. So it is this South Africa now, South Africa as the region leader, to take the leadership and follow through, ensuring that it is providing the economic leadership, reorganizing other lesser economies within the region, that when we go there, we have a niche and a unified voice as a bloc. And it goes also again to ECOWAS. But even if when we start talking as a SADC region, it is also within the SADC, we can, as countries, organize and see which each country is bringing on the table. That when we go there, we are not competing, because what we have seen now is, we have seen Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia, for example. They are competing for the same market, providing different conditions. When China comes to call for the agricultural production products, we are competing against ourselves instead of us organizing, and we provide conditions which are comparative and also comparative and additive to the region, not competing against each other, which is at the detrimental of individual African countries. So it is there to ensure that we have unified, we identify what do we want to serve to the to this international forums, and ensure that we have one unified conditions presenting at the international forums. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically within our regions, everyone should contribute what they are most capable of contributing and what they are best fitted by their natural environment to contribute. And then also we should be not competing in terms of price, but collaborating in terms of price so that no one can be forced to take a worse deal. I think that's a very, very clear position there. Now, given that we can perhaps possibly speak with this unified voice, what opportunities do you think this economic forum offers as an alternative away from the economic forums of the West?
No, I think for now we are going there not at a position of weakness. If you go what Russia is trying to achieve there, now they would be looking at us as partners, not as a lesser partners, but equal partners. That is something which I think at a political level we need to leverage at. Then we also have to look at the new revolution in the global financial architecture. If you look at the trade, the dollarization of the trade has, I think, at a ways disadvantaged Africa. But if we can look at now diversification of it, we are looking at now using the ruble, the UN, and how these countries, they're also investing in Africa. That would, I think, rebalance the trade balance for Africa as a continent. That's something which, as Africa, we need to take advantage of and I think support it more. Because the more we diversify and looking at the economic fight, if I can call it that way, between the West and the East, it provides opportunities. If Africa, we can reposition ourselves and be ready for it, we can take advantage of it and to propel our economies, I think, to a greater heights.
That's an interesting way to view it. Now, Russia does emphasize a multilateral South-South cooperation as well in sort of their, at least their political positioning, right? So how, what specific African mechanisms, you've already mentioned the free trade area, but what specific African mechanisms are available to us to ensure more cross-border economic corridors instead of fragmented bilateral deals?
No, I think on that one, it will need more of the political than economic. I think even if we look at the African free trade area, without the political will, I think it will only benefit the major players within the Africa. We are looking at the South African benefiting the Nigerian, the Sahel region, and a few of the Eastern, the Kenyans. But without the political will now to open up the borders to ensure that the free trade means exactly the free flow of goods and also we can't talk about the free trade or the free flow of goods without the free flow of the financial system again. If you look at that one, without breaking those barriers, I think which has been at economic level, I think a lot has been tried. For example, if you look at the commerce, if you are conversant with it, a lot has been tried. We have written and signed a lot of accords, but to ensure that we operationalize it, it needs the political will. And that political will, it always go back to the major players within the regions. If these major players, they can allow it to ensure that it works, it will definitely work. But the platforms are there. What requires now is the real political will and the political commitment to ensure that it works.
There's also the matter of sanctions and of countries imposing sanctions unilaterally on African states, like we've seen done to Zimbabwe. So, what practical alternative payment systems and insurances should African traders and governments be discussing at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum to keep commerce flowing safely from Western pressures?
No, that's precisely the greatest challenge we have. You look at it, for example, give you a number of examples. If you look at the trade between Zambia and Mozambique, neighboring countries, which I think there's a lot of volume which goes through there. There's one, the informal trading, which is the cross-border, which they use their individual currencies, which can easily swap through. But if you want to trade between Mozambique and Zambia formally, there's a need to use the dollar. Their key challenge remains. And now we have to advocate. We are going to the global south, the trade between Africa and Russia, Africa and China. There, then the common currency which has to be traded has to be a different one. As we'll be advocating that the trade between these two these regions has to use the unified currencies. We can take the ruble, the yuan, and also within Africa. It's so wonderful. You look at informally how the rand has become the trading currency within the SADC region, but formally it hasn't been. I think it's an opportunity which keeps on begging on us to ensure that at sub-region levels, we can have our regional currencies. I will tell you, if we can start trading at formally within the SADC using, for example, the rand, the trade balances for lesser countries, we look at Mozambique, you look at Malawi, it will not be as worse as it is now. Because for Malawi, the major trading partner, we import a lot from South Africa, but we have to call for a door. That creates a lot of macroeconomic instabilities within individual countries. So when we go there, I think the key thing is let's advocate and promote that when we are trading with Russia, for example, China, for example, let's create those vehicles, financial vehicles, which would trade within those currencies. And for within Africa, we should have a binding looking at how can we trade with them using our currencies that can back our currencies, can move the financial instabilities, the external market instabilities. That would promote growth and economic stabilities in Africa, which in the long run will promote, I think, the regional growth as a region. Thank you.
But I imagine this process of trying to create a strong alternative currency measure, it would need global coordination because as it stands now, the entire international community works together to buttress the dollar. Our dependence and reliance on the dollar is exactly what gives it the power that it has. So if we were to switch this thing up, it would need a sort of global movement. So do you think this St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is the type of place to begin that conversation of a global movement towards another currency?
It is. I don't think we can have a better forum, a better bastion to voice this than this. When you are looking at the St. Petersburg Forum, I think it is reposition taking all those who feels they have been on the margins of the financial architecture. So if there's a better forum, it's this one. And now looking at the way the animosities which have been there from the West, and you look with the Russia, the Chinas, I don't think we will ever have a better opportunity than this one.
And then finally, the Tanzanian president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, is participating as a high-profile guest speaker at the forum. What significance does her presence hold, especially in light of a historic 3-day visit to Russia that she took from the 3rd to the 5th of June just now, that is coming to, it's just starting, marking the first time a Tanzanian head of state has officially visited the country in 50 years?
No, I think we have to look at it that the currencies are changing, the undertones are changing. I think the global leaders have to recognize that what Africa needs is prosperity. What Africa needs is to have a space at the decision-making table. And I think having her as the face of the Africa, I think it's a huge honor and a huge responsibility which has been placed on her to push, I think, the narrative to ensure that now it reflects the needs of Africa. And I think I can never be more prouder than I am now looking at her and as a female figure who has led the country, and she's taking the initiative to, I think, to reposition Africa. And I think it's an opportunity that she gets the narrative and for the whole Africa, not just the Tanzania. Because if she presents that and she takes the voice for Africa, I feel it's just a massive coup for us. And we are looking at it, and even the West is watching. And that gives us a leverage. It's like in our local languages, we talk about two men trying to fight for a woman. Each tries to, I think, to bring the best they can. Now Africa is that woman, the bride to be. And it's how now we reposition, and the opportunity Her Excellency presents there. I think it's a great opportunity. That's all I can say.
All right, Mr. Chingwenwe, thank you so much for joining us to speak about the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum and what Africa should be doing when we get there. And I think you make a very good point about having to speak with a unified voice and a common bargaining position. But that being said, it does present a great opportunity because, like you say, Africa is the bride to be now, and we are the ones being fought over. So if we can negotiate from the right position, then who can tell what heights we can rise to? So thank you so much for joining us. Right, welcome back to our show. Now, can South Africa's fuel relief measures shield South Africa's economy from these global energy tensions? We're going to be talking right now about how South Africa's diesel price relief and temporary fuel levy reduction are helping cushion households, transport, and productive sectors from global oil market volatility linked to tensions in the Middle East and Iran and Israel and all of that, and Strait of Hormuz. Or is that really the case? Is this a good long-term intervention, or is it a short-term patch? My next guest is an incredibly informed individual. This is someone whose analysis is sharp, it's critical, and I think it's quite important. His name is Mametlo Sibi, and he's the president of the General Industries Workers Union of South Africa. And I think if you really want an informed perspective about this, there is no better person to talk to. So I am very honored to introduce him to our show. Here he is. I wanted to bring you on today so we can chat a little bit about this fuel relief measures that South Africa has taken up. So first and foremost, my first question is, how effective are these temporary diesel reliefs and fuel levy cuts in safeguarding, at least for industrial workers, the competitiveness that their manufacturing can have amid all of these shocks that we're seeing driven by conflict in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, we obviously welcome every relief. It makes a difference at the pump. However, we mustn't exaggerate what the relief has actually meant. It has certainly made a difference in terms of lowering the cost of fuel. But what we have seen across the economy is an increase in prices of, like food and other basics. The inflation rate last month went to 4%, accelerating quite massively compared to where it was a month before. The interest rates have been hiked by 25 basis points. And these are universal inputs that are going to permeate the rest of the economy, further raising the cost of living, which is also already a crisis for many working class, middle class, and poor people. So, and what we're seeing with the problem is that, and that's the reason we're saying price control, because there's obviously people taking advantage. That is the big, fuel monopolies that are seizing or taking advantage of the shocks in a global supply chains, and of course the financialized speculation in the markets, as in all other markets, foods and others. So you have more of increases happening because increases are anticipated, not because of the real cost of producing. But even when those costs actually come down, we don't always see the corresponding decreases in the cost of food, of transport, and everything else.
So it's basically because these companies benefit from these prices going higher and higher and higher. So even when the real cost comes down, as long as it's been higher, they'll try to push it higher and higher even more.
Absolutely. I mean, we can be sure. I mean, the price of diesel has come down this month, but we can be sure that all of the savings that comes with that are going to stay with the taxi and bus operators, with a retail as well as logistics, corporations, and all other, business owners, except reaching, the people, ordinary people that are customers, and public that desperately need this relief. And I mean, you can just take two industries as an example that I've cited, right? One is ask any South Africans, whether from Mamelodi, Soweto, Kaelicha, Umlazi, wherever. Never, ever have you ever had a situation wherein a taxi or a bus fare goes up because of the fuel prices, and when those prices come down, that price goes down. Never. Once a taxi fare is increased, it's permanent. That is a reality. But also read the reports of the Competition Commission on what they call, a report is called Essential Food Pricing Index Report. And what that report consistently complained about is the fact that fuel prices and other costs of production are used to justify passing over the increased prices to the customers. But when those same costs come down, we never see a corresponding and certainly a timeless reduction in the prices of those goods, including essential food. And that is a problem. It's because of the monopolized character of major sectors of this economy. And that is a reason we're absolutely insistent that the only way to manage this is through price controls on taxi and bus fares, on essential food like basic staples, maize meal, bread, meat, all of those, to ensure that the price of these basics are stabilized. And government must also nationalize the petroleum industry. Over and above the fact that when we have nationalized the petroleum industry, you are able to revitalize the refineries, you are able creating jobs that have been lost and livelihoods in many communities that have been devastated by the closures. At the same time, you are able to plan the oil security in this country in such a way that you buy crude oil when the prices are low and release it and store it and release it when there's exceptional periods of shocks like this one, so that ordinary people continue to enjoy an affordable oil and fuel supplies, as well as small business people that have been hit, hence are closing, and also people losing jobs in such huge and unaffordable numbers.
Yeah, it sounds like to me it's a quite clear analysis of there are plenty of mechanisms built into the system to make life more expensive for the worker, but there are no mechanisms built into the system to make life less expensive for the worker based on cost. And that is not something that necessarily must be the case. That is something that is being chosen by ignoring the policies that would do it. So I guess the next thing I want to talk about then is whether or not this offers any long-term relief, right? So it sounds from what you're saying that this is not a long-term solution, but rather a short-term thing that, okay, it's good at the pump for now, but there is no systemic change?
Well, good at the pump for now, how? When the petrol prices are now going up. They've gone up, right? In addition to a massive increase last month of more than 18%, in the price of petrol, but also of diesel, which was also very massive as well. So that is the reality. The only thing here is that the diesel prices are coming down. But remember, your average motorist doesn't use diesel. They use petrol, whose price has now went up again, right? Now, the diesel is used by taxis, is used by big trucks, but also by factories and farmers, right? Now, as I've said, I've already highlighted problems with that. Once a taxi and a bus fare has went up, I mean, I've used taxis before. Not once did I hear that the price have went up and have come down. Never. So that increase is permanent. That we can be sure about. We are going to have to live with for a very long time to come. But the same thing is happening in the retail shops. So from the taxi rank to the till at the shop, there's not going to be any impact. The cost of living crisis is going to continue, in addition to the fact that the monetary authorities are penalizing the working class, the middle class, the poor people who are reliant on credit for their homes, for their vehicles, for their furnitures, for their clothing, and other basic necessities. They are being penalized as if the inflation in the economy is being driven by the demand and the fact that they have too much money, when it is not. It is important, and if anything, actually, it is due to the war that the same oil cartels, the same fossil fuel cartels and monopolies are actually fueling.
Yeah, so it's not really a problem then that any one nation or one leader can address using things like, these diesel reductions or any sort of solitary policy. It sounds like an internationalist agenda that must be followed so that we can have real institutions that are able to hold these countries accountable when they are going at war, because those type of problems affect all of us at the end.
Well, I mean, the thing is, international institutions are only ultimately a conglomeration of national state institutions that themselves are ultimately organizations of the capitalist class, of the same corporate monopolies that dominate economies, that dominate the ownership of the minerals of the land. So they reflect that, because in the final analysis, an international or a foreign policy of any government is but application on the international plane of the domestic policy of that government. The idea that institutions made up of capitalist states like the ones we have here in South Africa, the American, the European, all of that will suddenly become or functioning in the interest of the ordinary people, of the working class, and not in the interest of the corporate monopolies that direct the domestic policies of the same states is not realistic. Ultimately, what we need is a worldwide movement of the working class to bring an end to a corporate monopolization of the economies, of the minerals, of the land in this country, but also in other countries as well. We need to build a socialist commonwealth of the workers' republics from one end of the planet to the other, so that we have the world economy that is in the hands of the ordinary people, that works for everybody, on the basis of public ownership, on the basis of democratic control and management of the working class, so that we have an industries that actually produce to meet the human needs. And of course, there is a fair and a just international division of labor to end imperialism that subordinate and subjugate certain countries to the domination and, of course, unfair trade terms with the others that create conditions of domination, violence that is actually now escalating into blood wars and genocides that you see everywhere across the world.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly true and incredibly important that we do highlight that these wars are a feature and not a bug in the capitalist system that is pervasive in the world right now. It's necessary for it to continue, or for capitalism to continue. These wars and things will also keep continuing. So the real problem to highlight is that one. Maybe bringing it back to South Africa. Here, how can government, industry, and unions sort of work together to ensure that these measures of relief or any sort of proper systemic measures that they would implement would reach vulnerable workers and the people that need them?
Well, in fact, it is that working together of trade unions, of business, of government that has brought us where we are. What we do need is an independent class and political policy of the working class and its movement. We need to understand that the system is rigged and rigged against our interest, the interest of the working class, and because there are people who are profiteering from our misery, from our exploitation, and of course, the situation that we currently have. And this is not based on some misunderstanding. We have NETLAC, we have all of these institutions of class collaboration, and out of which, and notwithstanding that, we are having all of these attacks that are happening on the working class, the cost of living crisis, the devastating and catastrophic levels of unemployment, the monetary policy that is actually, basically redistributing wealth upward, making ordinary people to pay interest rates that are extortionate, that actually and only enrich a top tiny elite, something like 0.1% of the population that is owning the vast majority of the financial assets in society. That is the reason that we are here. What do we need? The working class must understand that it cannot trust on anybody else except its own unity, organization, and struggle. And for that, it requires a program to take political power in this country, but more than that, an economic power through nationalizations of the banks, of the factories, of the mines, of the farms, to ensure that we build an economy that can work in the interest of the ordinary and of the working class people. There is so much that can be done, so much that can be achieved. We must be able to make sure that the state take over all the refineries, all the oil companies, to build a state and a publicly owned petroleum company that can make sure, first and foremost, everybody get affordable fuels, but there's also a transitioning. This country has an abundance of the mineral base and the natural renewable energy resources to make sure that we transition and we break our dependence on monopolized foreign oil imports. That is holding us at ransom, and that is creating all of this instability in prices, right, and inflation and all of that and so on. Because if we do that, we are able to leverage the mineral base of this country to make sure that we produce hydrofuels that are clean, renewable, sustainable, but also make sure that we transition towards solar, wind power. There's abundance of renewable energy resources in this country, on the basis of which we can power, right, mass public transport systems, from railways to trams and buses, and expand that infrastructure to every corner of the country in a way that we can reduce massively the cost of living. Because the two single items that consume majority of the working class income is actually electricity and transport, right? These are energy-driven costs, right? So an average worker spend about 57% of their income on these two items. 57%. So if you bring the fuel industry under public ownership, you transition to locally produced fuels, but also you make sure that you expand, make efficient, but also affordable public transport in every corner of the country. You can be able to reduce all of that and ensure that workers spend less than 10% of their income on these two items, and so that there's enough to buy food, to buy clothing, to build homes for their children, for their families, and do a whole lot of other things that the working class can't afford at the moment. Because with these prices, with this cost of living, it is a question of whether you put a petrol in your car, or you have a money for the taxi, or buy food for your children. So much children are starving and are hungry in this country, the most industrialized in the African continent. That is simply criminal.
All right, that brings us to the end of our program today. It's been quite a packed one, from speaking to the Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, to speaking to a development economist in Malawi, all the way to listening to a Marxist analysis of South Africa and the fuel levy that has been introduced in South Africa, which will keep diesel prices down a little bit. But as we've seen from our interview, is this really a long-term solution? Perhaps not. It's been a jam-packed show today. We'll always be back to give you more. But for today, I've been Seakga Tladi, and I'm out of here.